Hello and thanks for tuning in. I'm Holly Shields, welcoming you all to another edition of Kalkine TV's Executive Corner Expert Talks. Today we're shining a light on one company that's at the intersection of greener mobility management and high-tech transport tracking and metrics. Golocate is building on the power of the fleet, combining real-time insights and predictive analytics to help businesses make better, more data-informed decisions. And joining us today to share his insights is Sam Wright, co-founder of Golocate. Welcome to the show, Sam. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on. Now, first of all, Sam, how important would you say it is for fleet owners to get on top of their data and logistics?
I mean, data is imperative to what many fleets are trying to do. I mean, it's been imperative to operation for the past 5 to 10 years, albeit not necessarily geared towards carbon neutrality. So if you think about how a fleet operates, the large majority, in fact, actually 86% of fleets use a telematics solution to track a whole load of data points, whether that is driver behavior, such as speed, braking, harshness of turns, but also actually towards fuel usage, how frequently they're fueling, but also what the optimization is around their fuel levels. Historically, that has been kind of the bare minimum of the data, with only 23% of fleets actually using big data analytics to guide their strategic decision-making moving forward. What we believe is that fleets are now having to leverage and utilize historic and present data to actually inform their future strategic decision-making, because ultimately that will allow fleets to not only plan ahead when they start to tackle the bigger picture here, which is obviously becoming carbon neutral and net zero, but actually being able to isolate where they're currently falling short, where they're currently performing well, and ultimately where they need to optimize moving forward to achieve the desirable results.
Right, I can imagine it's really important for stakeholders in the business to be able to see all that information very clearly and to identify the weak points when it comes to a business's fleet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as with any business, whether it's fleet or non-fleet related, to have visibility at a stakeholder level is absolutely imperative, especially when you're talking about something such as carbon neutrality. Ultimately, you have to report on it as a business, and this is not only available internally, but is also shared with external stakeholders, and also comes with some fairly hefty fines if the reporting is not up to scratch. So I think for businesses now, so more than ever before, it's absolutely vital to not only have visibility at every single level of the business, but actually to have confidence that the data points you're pulling and basing your reports on are not only up to standard, but are completely accurate. And that's something that we are massively trying to champion and promote here at Golocate.
That's great to hear. I can imagine that's obviously the case, that those data points are very crucial indeed. And we touched on carbon neutrality just earlier. I'd like to know, how exactly does Golocate help businesses achieve carbon neutrality and decrease their emissions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a number of ways in which we do it. I think carbon offsetting as a sector sometimes can get a bit of a bad rep just because of greenwashing and a number of other slightly questionable practices that potentially have kind of plagued the business to date. So for us, one of the main ways in which we try to establish this is through transparency. Ultimately, that's at the heart of everything we do, whether that's on the data side of the business or the carbon neutrality offsetting side of the business. I think if we were to break it down as a sector, the transport sector as a whole accounted for 33% of all CO2 emissions globally in 2021. So it's one of the single largest contributors, and therefore, in our eyes, is one of the biggest issues to tackle. And that's why we're ultimately trying to work very closely with not only fleets, but a whole load of different assets to ensure that we can best position them to reach carbon neutrality. How we do that? Well, there's a number of ways. The main way in which we do this at present is we plug into their current telematics solutions via an API key. We leverage the behavioral data points I just mentioned, but then also pull a whole load of fresh data points to ascertain the carbon footprint of the assets. What we do is we appreciate that every business is unique, and therefore this is reflected in the solution we build for that business. Every business has their own unique goals and aspirations when you think about carbon neutrality and offsetting. And therefore we want to treat every business on a case-by-case basis. So what they do is they receive a bespoke dashboard, which is tailored to their specific goals, but also the specific data points that will help them reach their goals. What we then do is we empower the businesses to support a whole array of projects that align closely with their internal values and record all of their impact in a real-time registry which allows them to track and demonstrate their progress towards their goals. Ultimately, what this does is it provides one source of truth and a partner that they can rely on throughout their whole journey to a net zero operation.
That's incredible to hear. It sounds like you're definitely doing a lot of the work for them there, and especially those solutions are, I can imagine, hyper tailored to each business's need, which is obviously quite key.
Absolutely. And I think a realization that Mike and I, my co-founder, very quickly came to was that a lot of fleet managers, their background is in running fleets and the day-to-day operations of maintaining and managing assets. That necessarily doesn't extend to carbon offsetting and sustainability. And therefore, rather than expecting them to add another chink to their wheelhouse, it's more, how can we best empower them through the data they currently use and leverage on a daily basis to not only understand the issue at hand, but have confidence that they can manage that operation.
It's great to hear. Obviously, it's very important. Like you said, not everyone knows about the technicalities, I would say, of fleet management. It's an interesting point there. And it's great to hear that you assist in that manner as well. And, speaking of offsetting of fleet's emissions, what does it take to achieve this? You mentioned that the data points are used to plot out, how a business can improve perhaps their operations in that regard. But what exactly does it take to achieve that carbon neutrality?
Yeah, I mean, the journey towards carbon neutrality is not an easy one, and it's by no means a short one. Businesses will face a number of challenges along the way, depending on size and the scale of their operation. What we find is that bigger corporations naturally have more resources behind them, and therefore can swallow the cost of say, transitioning a fleet of 1,000 vehicles from petrol and diesel to electric overnight, whereas smaller businesses potentially don't have that luxury, and therefore they need to think a bit more strategically around how they can move the needle as far as possible, whilst also upkeeping and maintaining their operational efficiency. I think from our point of view, one of the main barriers towards businesses achieving net zero and becoming carbon neutral is this trade-off between being sustainable and maintaining operational efficiency. If you have 100 vehicles in your fleet and they're all stopping to charge for 40 minutes a day, it ends up around 17,000 hours a year, which you would lose on their road time. And traditionally, that time would be spent taking on commercial opportunities, fulfilling contracts, and therefore for fleets to make that transition and that jump, you need to mitigate that financial loss as much as possible. And I think one thing that we're trying to really champion here at Golocate at the moment is the journey towards electrification is a long one. And whilst the current infrastructure is as it is, which is fairly poor, if you look in the UK, there's 13 electric vehicles to every one charger. In the US, it's 18 to 1. Those ratios are not particularly promising for commercial fleets. What we want to do is empower them to say, hey, you don't need to transition your fleet overnight. You can scale it out over the next 5-6 years in line with the local goals. And what you can actually do is through our solutions and through our systems, you can transform your petrol and diesel assets into ones that are carbon neutral, therefore still operating in a sustainable way, incentivizing them to operate in a sustainable way without necessarily having that operational impact and also impacting their commercial success, which I think is the real key to actually achieving something substantial here.
It's great to hear. It sounds like you've found a middle ground, would you say, for these businesses where they don't have to make this big leap to the transition, which is, I can imagine, quite costly for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the exact the exact key point that we're trying to deliver on here. We are not seeking to prevent or prohibit the transition towards electrification, but actually what we want to do is to be able to show businesses and incentivize businesses to act and perform in a greener way. We want to give them confidence that they can be sustainable without having to make all of those sacrifices I just mentioned. And whilst that's not the end goal solution, of course, I'm an avid believer, an advocate that electric vehicles are the future of commercial fleets and commercial assets. I believe right now that the infrastructure and the network is not strong enough to facilitate that. And therefore, what we want to do is be a stepping stone towards something greater. If we can change the mindset of even a fraction of those commercial fleets, which are constituting 33% of the global CO2, then I'll be very happy at the end of it.
It's great to hear. It's a very important point there, and I can't argue with that too much. But speaking of which, do you see that the transition becoming easier over time, perhaps, as we do embrace these electric vehicles and greener transportation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so Mike and I were in Lisbon in November at the Web Summit conference, and you couldn't go anywhere without seeing e-bikes and e-scooters as the main means of transport in the city centre. And for me, that's a massive way in which you not only eradicate people that are driving vehicles and cars, but actually promoting green and sustainable travel. I think it will 100% get easier. I mean, the speed in which electric vehicles are now being sold is greater than ever before. You have companies like Tesla obviously pioneering the world of EV, but also a number of luxury car manufacturers also now launching their own electric vehicle lines. So I think in time it will 100% get easier. I mean, the chip shortage has certainly played a part in slowing down progress, but I believe from what I hear on the ground that that's something that is improving. So as we kind of emerge out of 2022, I do believe there will be quite a significant ramp up. I mean, community charging is playing a massive part of improving and kind of creating a charging network here in London, which is amazing to see. A lot of people don't have driveways and therefore potentially would be put off the prospect of transitioning towards an electric vehicle simply because they wouldn't know where to charge them. So I think community charging is playing a very large part. I think we're seeing some really, really great charging networks, especially those that kind of leverage and utilize rapid chargers. So I think it's 100% something that will improve in time. As with anything, I think it's going to kind of have to reach a tipping point where the number of assets that are on the road will require and constitute a much heavier investment from the government than what's currently being provided.
I think you're quite right there, definitely. And obviously it'd be good to see that transition pick up speed as it likely will in the coming years. So very, very good to see that. Hopefully not too far away. Now I understand as well that Golocate works in a number of different industries with obviously several clients in these industries. Could you maybe tell us about some of the different sectors and industries that Golocate works with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the beauty of being a mobility management company means that mobility has a lot of verticals, which has been great for us from a business point of view, because it means that there's so much versatility in the companies that we work with, but also the impact we can have. And it's incredibly rewarding to be able to see the impact across a number of different sectors. So whilst I've obviously touched on commercial vehicles a lot during this conversation so far, because those are kind of our main bread and butter clients, mainly because that's where most businesses operate, we're by no means restricted to that. So when we actually validated the product and Golocate as a service itself, it was working in the US with the NASA project at Oregon State University, and we actually facilitated the first carbon offset rocket launch, which was a really interesting experience, I guess, to send a rocket up into the atmosphere and for it to be net zero, and also for the telematics to actually work when there's no infrastructure in place to support it, was really quite special for us, and I think was a real turning point for the business. In terms of kind of who we're working with at the moment, we're working with a number of micro-mobility companies, so kind of e-bikes and e-scooters. I think for me, that's a really fascinating vertical because they're growing at such speed and there's so many challenger brands. So I mentioned Lisbon earlier on in the call. Lisbon has, I think, 12 companies that work in the e-scooter space alone in Lisbon. So all of their bikes and their scooters are on the ground. How do you, if you're one of those companies, use predictive analytics and future insights to ensure that you're depositing your assets in locations whereby tourists and users are going to be picking them up most frequently? That's a really interesting vertical for the business for me in particular. Then you also look at last mile delivery services. I don't know what the last mile delivery service industry is looking like in Australia at the moment, but I know off the back of lockdown here, it's absolutely booming, and it's very much reliant on having dark kitchens and warehouses that they can then go to pick up stock and then obviously go and drop goods off at customers on a very quick turnaround basis. For us, the solution can be used to help support their expansion plans, whether that is where they distribute their next warehouse or where they have their assets standing by. So again, really, really fascinating. And then I guess one final one to touch on would be the maritime sector. So the maritime sector is one of the largest contributors when it comes to CO2 and emissions. As you can imagine, they're traveling much longer distances, and the fuel that they're using is not exactly conducive to a green environment. They are slowly but surely coming to the realization that things need to change. And thankfully, Golocate is involved in those conversations. And hopefully what we'll be able to do is to kind of continue this trend of building out bespoke solutions, leading the way for a number of slightly outdated industries, providing solutions that ultimately will not only allow them to operate in a greener way, but actually have a real impact to the way in which those industries and those businesses operate moving forward. So those are just a few of the industries that we're working on at the moment. I think long term, whilst we're predominantly focused on transport right now, this will extend to to drones, to icebreakers, to aeroplanes, we don't really have a ceiling at present. And if the opportunity is exciting for us and we think that we can leave a mark, we will 100% explore it.
That's incredible to hear. It's always great that you have a very open outlook there, and it's terrific as well that you have a very diverse range of sectors and opportunities, I think, that you're working with at the moment. So that's always great. And is there anything specific we can look forward to in 2022?
Absolutely, yes. I think 2021 was a year of ideation and kind of stabilization for us. We undertook a bit of a pivot, and we kind of were working out where we fit in within the market, but also what problems we want to tackle first. I think now we have that locked down and validated. 2022 is going to be a year of growth and progression, not only here in the UK, but also internationally. We'll be taking a trip back to Lisbon to see what we can do on the e-mobility side of things, as well as exploring a number of commercial opportunities overseas as well. I guess if we were having this conversation in a year's time, there would be a lot more sectors added to that list, and a lot more conversations and use cases to validate the solution.
Well, that's great to hear. It sounds like you have a very action-packed year ahead of you, and a very open one as well. So it'll be really exciting to see everything that you have going on, and we'll definitely keep an eye on that. But with that said, it's been really great talking to you today, Sam. Thanks very much for joining us on Executive Corner Expert Talks.
Thank you for having me. Real pleasure.
Pleasure to have you on. Thanks for your time as well, viewers. If you've just joined us, that was Sam Wright, the co-founder of Golocate. They're doing some incredible work in this space, so keep an eye out. And remember to stay apprised and invest wise with Kalkine. I'm Holly Shields for Kalkine Media.